Today we are at Fort Missoula in the western part of the valley, and Fort Missoula is a beloved place for many Missoulians. We come here to walk our dogs, and we attend presentations here. The Forest Service office is here, and the Historical Museum is here. And there is a lot of history here. There used to be more buildings from different eras. There's an old cemetery I like to go to and visit. And there's a sweat lodge here, the native students at the University of Montana. The river is just right over there, and it's a beautiful spot. The Bold Women series started at Mountain Press, its publisher, several years ago, over 10 years ago. And it's a state-by-state series that focuses on women who have made a difference, who have great stories, who may not be known or who may be very well known. And each book is a collection of chapters that takes, the woman's life as its subject. I loved all of these women, and you kind of have to in order to write about them. You have to love them. You learn about what motivated them and why they did things, and you work hard to understand that. And sometimes that takes research. So I do love all of them. But Eloise Cobell was so persistent and dedicated to righting a wrong that had been going on for 100 years, over 100 years. Starting in 1887, the United States government divvied up some Indian reservations from communal ownership to individual ownership. And at that time they said, okay, you Indian people, you don't really know how to use banks. You don't really know about money. We will be your bank. We will be the bank for both tribes and for individual people. And so when they divvied up the reservations, people had land that could make them money. They could have it logged. Some of it was good for agriculture. Some of it had oil on it. And these were all sources of income. And the government said, we'll make sure that we get that making money for you. And they did. But it turned out that there were many problems with this system, that people would have 5 oil rigs on their land, but they would get $60 a year royalties. And we're talking some of the poorest people in the United States. And there was also great trouble in getting their money out. We can go to a bank and say, yes, I want $25, thank you, goodbye. But they would go and they'd say, I want $25, and they'd say, I'm sorry, we can't give that to you today. I mean, there was just all kinds of trouble in getting money out when they needed it. And Eloise Cobell, I feel, is sort of like a Joan of Arc, because she grew up hearing about this problem, even when she was little, because her parents were tribal leaders. But then she studied accounting in college, and then was hired in the 80s. She was in her 30s, early 30s, to become the treasurer of the Blackfeet Nation. And as an accountant, she was just flummoxed. They were just a mess. They didn't make any sense. And so she called the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of the Treasury, said, can you help? I don't understand this. And she never really got good answers. She reached out to other tribal treasurers. They said, yes, we know what you're talking about. We know exactly what you're talking about. It's our problem also. And so she went to Congress. A lot of people weren't interested in helping her figure this out, but a Senator Sinar, or Representative Sinar, from Oklahoma, had many Native constituents. And he said, I'll help you figure this out. And so they did a congressional investigation. They found terrible malfeasance in dealing with records, and in dealing with people's money. And amazingly, even though the Department of the Treasury, Department of the Interior were issued warnings, were told that they had to change this, that they had to produce, they had to right this wrong, nothing changed. And so Eloise just couldn't believe it, but she went to another meeting in Washington with all these officials, and I think they saw her as a complainer, and they just said, sue us. And she said, okay, I will. And I believe that was in 1996, that she and a Native American rights organization and one of the foremost banking lawyers in the country. They all brought suit on behalf of Eloise as the lead plaintiff, but over 300,000 other Native people around the country who were individual account holders. And it took 16 years. It didn't matter whether the president was Democrat or Republican. It was a tough battle. The government, again and again, Eloise was proven right, but the government would always appeal. They had like hundreds of lawyers working on it. And, but finally, I think it was after 13 years, there was a settlement. And it was the largest class action settlement that anyone has ever won against the government. And it still took 3 more years. And unfortunately, Eloise died before she got any money, and before the case was absolutely settled. But there's a picture of her shaking hands with President Obama. That's when finally it was mostly coming to an end, and she had a victory. Jeannette Rankin is a native Missoulian. She's the only native Missoulian in my book. And she is of national importance because she was the first woman to go to Congress. She went in 1917, she was elected in 1916. And this is before women throughout the country had the vote. But Jeannette had worked really, really hard to get women's suffrage passed in Montana. She had driven in her Model A or T, I'm not sure what, crisscrossed our very large state, trying to get everyone to support women's suffrage. And in so doing, she kind of unwittingly laid the groundwork for her own election to Congress, which she believed was important so that people in the United States could see that a woman could handle that job, and that she felt that would help the whole country support suffrage. But Jeannette wasn't just important to suffrage in Montana. She worked hard across the country for suffrage, starting in Washington State, but she worked in California, she worked in the South, she worked in the Midwest, and she was very, very effective because she had studied public speaking, even though she had been shy, and she became a mesmerizing speaker. And she really worked hard at whatever she did. And she really wanted to fix the ills that affected our country. And she went, as a young person, she went out to New York and Boston and saw the slums and poverty there, the problems that immigrants had, and she decided she wanted to do something about it, and she had to do something about it. She was part of the progressive era. I think women in American history everywhere, there's so many cool women, wonderful, amazing women who have contributed so much. It is fun sometimes to think, how are these women specific to Montana? And does Montana add into the mix of why they were so bold? And I think Montana there's hardship in Montana, especially in the olden days, but there is even now. And I think that makes people appreciate these women so much. But I think that when there's hardship, you learn to become self-sufficient. And you learn that really no one else may help you. You have to help yourself. And that gives you a certain kind of freedom. And I think all of these women grew up with that kind of freedom. And they also grew up with economic hardship. And therefore, the roles that women were assigned in parts of the United States that were older and had more money, they just didn't, those roles didn't apply here. Girl children had to work just like boy children. And so they learned to break horses just like the boys did, and they became bronc riders. Or Jeannette Rankin, she built a sidewalk for her father's hotel because she could. And there are many examples like that. I have been inspired in my own life by the example of other women and men. And I know what it feels like to be inspired, to ask for help and to get it, and what a huge difference that makes in our lives. And I would love it if some young woman or young man reads my book and says, okay, I want to do X, I'm going to go for it. Or I'm having a hard time right now, but Jeanette Rankin overcame having a mentally ill mother and a hard childhood. I can too. You know, Eloise Cobell made a huge difference for Indian people across the country, grew up poor. I can do that too. Maybe I can.